Hello, everyone. On behalf of the National Association of State Auditors, Comptrollers, and Treasurers, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled From AI Hype to AI Value: What State Auditors, Controllers, and Treasurers Need to Know. My name is Josh Winfrey, and I am the Executive Director of NASACT. I will be serving as your host for today's event. We are joined today by over 900 government accountants, auditors, and other interested parties. Everywhere you look and every article you read talks about AI and that we're in the midst of a technological revolution. But what I continually hear is, what can it do for me? Today, we're going to learn about some use cases in government finance, which I'm excited about. But before we get started, I've got to do some housekeeping. We're using a tool called Conferences.io to submit attendance codes and request CPE. To do this, each participant will need to use the internet browser on your computer or mobile device. Please open a browser and navigate to nasact.cnf.io. You can see it on your screen right now, and we also have a QR code, nasact.cnf.io. Next, you need to click on today's session. You will then be prompted to enter your name and email address. Be sure to enter your name as you wish it to appear on your CPE certificate. At various times throughout the webinar, the speaker will arrive at a slide which contains a 3-digit CPE code. I'll be reading out those codes as we go. The first code, Lance, if you'll advance one slide, this is the first code of the session. This is 724, the first code, not a test. This is the first code, 724. Please enter that into the system now. When a CPE code slide appears, like the one you see on your screen now, tap the Code Words button located in the upper right-hand corner and submit the CPE code. This is our way of verifying that you are actively engaged, which is a requirement for any CPE session being held virtually. Today's webinar qualifies for 1.5 CPE credit hours, which means we will have 5 total attendance checks in order to comply with the CPE standards prescribed by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must provide the codes for all 5 attendance checks to receive full credit. A CPE certificate will be emailed to you within 3 weeks. To ask a question during the webinar, simply type and submit your question using the social Q&A feature in your browser. You can also upvote questions you see that you like. The structure of today's session includes some moderated Q&A between myself and the speakers, but we will try to get to some of those most upvoted audience questions, time permitting. Our presenters will be using PowerPoint for this session, and a copy should have been provided to you prior to the session, and it's also available on the webinar page. If you have any questions or experience any problems during the webinar, please email Meredith Johns at mjohns@nasact.org. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Lance Schone is a director and consulting expert with CGI, and Chris Knight is a government strategist with Microsoft and former NASACT member. Lance, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Josh. Appreciate it. I also want to thank Meredith, who is diligently working behind the scenes and has been supporting this effort. So it's great to have this group together. I know how much it goes into preparing for these sessions, and I just really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. So as I get started today, I want to take a minute to just kind of acknowledge this title of this session, right? From AI hype to AI value. We picked this title very intentionally, right? Because I think we are in a moment where the hype around AI is so very loud, right? But the actual value at times can be a little bit quieter, right? So before we get started, I do want to explain the plan for today. So I'm going to do an introduction, kind of set the stage for the Q&A and the dialogue that we're going to have later. My plan is to take about 35 minutes, and I'm going to do 3 things. I'm first going to talk about where is the market right now, right? This difference between the hype and the reality. I'm also going to talk about where most organizations actually are in their AI journey. There's kind of a perception and there's a reality, and we're going to talk about that. And the next thing I'm going to do after that is going to introduce 3 foundations that I believe really determine whether your AI initiative is going to succeed or is going to fall flat and stall out, right? And then finally, because everybody likes to have practical things that they can apply. I'm going to kind of leave you with some recommendations based upon what we're seeing across our clients and government in general. And then that's when, after I do that introduction, we'll bring on Chris into the conversation. And he adds a really valuable perspective, like something that I can't, right? He has sat in the seat, the comptroller's seat before, so he understands the challenges from the inside. All right, so let's start by taking a look at the gap between the promise and the reality of AI, right? So the everywhere you turn, right? Josh mentioned this, right? The conversation about AI is so loud, it's so prevalent. It's happening in budget conversations, strategic plans, vendor pitches, right? I'm sure everybody has been overwhelmed by so many pitches around AI. You hear it at every conference. And you definitely can't turn on any type of news, whether it's tech news, business news, government news, and not see the headlines about AI, right? I get it. It makes sense, right? The potential of AI is real. The technology is impressive. I still remember when I first played with ChatGPT about almost 4 years ago. I was completely, like jaw dropped to cancel the rest of my meetings that week to play with it, right? But here's the reality, right? There is a little bit of a gap between kind of the hype and all of the noise around it and what people are actually doing, and specifically the value that they're getting. So what we know is that a lot of agencies are still exploring, they're still piloting, some are testing some very specific use cases, but very few have actual like operational production deployments where they are seeing some like real business value, right? And there's a disconnect there, and that's not because the technology is like super challenging, and it's not because people don't want to succeed, right? Like that's not it. But there are really challenging things outside the technology, things like data, things like governance, things like adoption, right? And that's what this conversation is really about, right? So let's kind of examine this gap through the lens of numbers. I think everybody in this audience loves numbers. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to kind of read all of these stats, but I did want to explain why I included them. Right. So if you look at this, you can see different statistics from a variety of different sources, right? So this is not one report making like a bold, outlandish, claim, right? This is a pattern that we're seeing across the market. And the theme is pretty clear here, right? Adoption is moving fast, but the value is not always being realized, right? So what are we seeing? We're seeing that organizations, they're experimenting, they're investing in people and tools. They are, though, still struggling to turn those investments into some measurable impact, right? Now, the one stat I want to kind of focus in on and zoom in on here is the one in the lower right that Boston Consulting Group did, right? So they have noted that only a small share of AI initiatives are actually creating value at scale. And while, the majority generate little to no actual material value. So, that doesn't mean that AI lacks potential. I'm not here to say, oh, don't worry about AI, right? I'm not a doomer by any means at all. But the point that I'm trying to put a point on is that value doesn't just automatically happen, right? There's no easy button like, oh, you bought a tool, you're gonna, see results, right? It really depends on whether your organization has the right foundations underneath the technology. And those foundations are specifically different in government. So let's talk about that, right? One thing that I think gets missed a lot when we talk about AI is that government AI is fundamentally different than commercial AI, right? Let that sink in for a second. So a lot of the public conversation is really shaped by the private sector and their kind of mantra or their ethos of let's move fast, let's do things very aggressively, let's scale fast, and let's fail, as early as possible, right? But government operates in a completely different accountability environment, right? If something goes wrong in government, people notice and people start asking questions, right? Auditors ask questions, legislators ask questions, the public asks questions. And the real truth is that trust is harder to rebuild in government than it is in the commercial sector, right? If you fail in the commercial sector, but you rebound with some great earnings, you're going to probably build some trust back, right? But in the government, that's not a luxury, right? So the caution that we see in government is not necessarily a weakness or a flaw, right? In many cases, it is a signal of responsible leadership. And that's why, having this dialogue with folks that are on this call, right? Folks from finance and audit and treasury, like that's why you are important to this conversation, right? Like you're not on the edge or the outside of this AI conversation. You are right in the center of it, right in the middle of it. And that's why I think it's important for us just to pause for a second and talk about who is in the room today or on this call today and why your roles matter so much. All right. So if we think about it, I'm sure, right, we've got a good number of auditors, we've got controllers, we've got finance leaders, we have treasurers, and all of, joining together in this virtual room. And that mix is very important, right? Because AI in government, it's not just an IT challenge. It's not just an IT project. It's not just an IT issue, right? Let me explain what I mean by that. So you guys hold some of the most important operational data in government, right? I'm talking about things like budget data, procurement data, payroll data, all the general ledger activity, right? You also define and establish like the business workflows that AI is going to interact with, right? Things like approvals and reviews, reconciliations, reporting, right? Exception handling. And then you have auditors, right, who are just as important. You have a very clear perspective around controls, traceability, right? Evidence, accountability, right? So those roles are not just, you know, like out on the tangents, kind of out on the inside, right? Like you have the potential and the ability to make AI work both from a trust responsible perspective and also effective, right? So now that we've talked about who's in the room, let's take a look at what we're seeing in the market, right? And I think this slide is important because, quite frankly, there is a lot of pressure right now to appear further along than you really are, right? Every conference you go to, it can make it sound like everyone else is accelerating, right, to the moon with AI. And that, though, is not really what we're seeing in reality. So most organizations are still somewhere in those first two steps between exploration and pilots. So some have very selective deployments in very specific areas, but very few have AI deeply embedded into daily operations, especially not at scale, right? And for government, that pacing actually makes a little bit of sense, right? The accountability environment is different. Like we mentioned, the risk tolerance is very, very different than in the commercial sector. And what I feel that is most important, right? The governance requirements are exceptionally different than in the public sector, right? So personally, I don't interpret being early as being behind. I actually think the better question is to ask, right? Are you building the conditions, the environment is going to allow you to accelerate in advance in a very controlled, effective way, right? And the good news is there is some good news in all of this, right? The good news is that I think your organizations already have many of the conditions that you need to be successful. All right. So let's take a deeper dive into the good news, right? This is the encouraging part, right? You already own many of the things that an effective AI implementation depend on, right? You have a lot of operational data. You have a strong culture of controls, and you actually have real tangible use cases, right? So many times we talk to folks and outside of government, and they just want to use AI to say that they're using AI, and they don't actually have great business use cases. You do. You have things like, right, document processing, compliance review, reporting. I could go on and on. These things are tangible advantages, right? This is not an abstract concept. This is actually real. So if you contrast that, right, a lot of organizations they struggle with AI because they lack structure. Their data is all over the place, spread across a multitude of systems. They may have inconsistent or undefined processes, and then forget about governance model, right? A lot of organizations, especially in the commercial sector, right, they have no governance model or it's very, very immature, right? If we contrast that with you, governance, finance environments, you have probably more structure than you realize, right? But Here's the reality, right? Having the ingredients to success is not the same thing as having a successful program, right? The trick is how you use those ingredients. So I like to say, right, I could have all the ingredients that Bobby Flay uses for his famous crunch burger recipe, right? But without the recipe, I'm doomed. I'm not going to be able to make that, right? So that leads me to the three foundations that are going to be kind of the core to the rest of our discussion. That's data, governance, and adoption.
Mhm. Here we are. Here's our second code of five, everyone. 959. Please take a moment to enter that into Conferences.io. 959. All right, Lance, back to you.
All right, thanks, Josh. All right, so let's go back to this conversation, and I'm going to provide you with a framework or a recipe. If we think Bobby Flay, right? This is a framework that I think is effective, right? So if we look at when AI initiatives either succeed or they stall and kind of fall flat, it usually doesn't come down to the technology. It really comes down to whether an organization has the foundation to use AI responsibly and operationally, right? So, specifically for government, I think these three foundations are what determines success. So, first is data, right? I'd like to kind of frame this in through questions, right? Is your data is the underlying information your data, is it accurate? Is it consistent? Is it well understood by your organization? Is it ready to support your AI use cases, right? That's a really fundamental question to ask. The next foundation is governance, right? Are the rules clear? Do you know who is accountable? Do you know what gets should get reviewed, what gets logged, what is audited? And maybe the most important question, what remains under human control, right? Like the human's still going to be in the loop. What is kind of under their domain of control? And the third foundation for success is adoption. Okay. People must be comfortable and trust the AI enough to use it actually in their daily work, right? We'll talk a little bit about this, but just doing an implementation doesn't equal success, right? People actually have to use it. So most AI initiatives, if they stall or they're going to get tripped up by one of these, sometimes all three, but usually one is a specific breaking point. So my plan here is now that I've introduced these foundations, let's go through each one in a little bit more detail, and let's start with the first, which is data. Okay. Now, this quote on the screen, this is why I have put data first, right? I chose this statistic because I think it makes the point very directly, right? We all know that data quality matters, right? And that's pretty obvious in your business, right? The quality of data and the accuracy of data is critical. But read this stat, right? What Gardner is saying that by next year, only 30% of organizations are going to have sufficient data quality to actually fully leverage AI capabilities, right? So if you reflect on that, what is that saying? That means that this is not a small issue, right? There are still going to be a lot of organizations that are far away from being prepared. And this is not just limited to government, right? So this is looking broader beyond government. So at least know, hey, you're not alone here, right? And the real point is that AI readiness, it depends on the readiness of your data, right? A direct link there, right? So before you can ask yourself, hey, what can AI do for me? You need to be asking yourself, is my data actually ready to support what I want to do with AI, right? Kind of flip the script there. So the practical question that you're probably asking yourself is like, how do I know if my data is ready, right? You're probably saying, hey, this makes sense, but like, what does this actually mean? So like, give me some actual details and explain this. So now, if you think about it, almost every organization that is on the call with us today, right? You probably have lots of data. Some of you probably literally have decades and decades of data. But having data and having data that is ready for AI, those are two separate things, right? So let me ask you a question. This is a rhetorical question. You don't have to put it in the chat, but how many of the people on the call today, how many have you been through some sort of system migration or a system upgrade? And for those of you who have, ask yourself, how many have carried forward data that you knew was maybe a little bit questionable or a little bit suspect, right? I'm guessing more than one, right? In this many, you probably had many good reasons, whether it's data retention policies, right, or just a need to kind of report on that historical data, and you had to keep it there, right? But the fact is, you're probably bringing some data that maybe was not quite ready for prime time, or you knew had some sort of issues or workarounds in it, right? So the point is when you use AI, right, it's going to surface issues with your data. So if we contrast that with, right, how you can work around issues through a manual process, right? You can kind of document what your inconsistencies are, what your workarounds are, where there's duplicate data, that's fine. You can work around that in a manual process, right? But as soon as you bring in AI, you're talking about you're creating this multiplier, this scale effect. And AI is going to multiply whether the data is good quality or it's bad quality, right? So you need to be aware of that. And that's why I kind of bring back this old phrase, right? Garbage in, garbage out. And I add the qualifier there. It's at scale, right? But here's the good news, right? I like to bring it back to good news. The good news is that your finance organizations, they traditionally start in a stronger position than those outside of finance, right? You have foundationally some really tight structured data, especially probably over the past decade. So the foundation is there. So the work is really taking a look at your data, making sure that you have identified what is high quality, what is reliable, and specific for the use case that you want to implement. That's the key, right? Okay, so this leads us to three practical steps that I recommend every organization take a look at before they move forward in their AI journey. So, step one is to assess your data. So, I'm not just talking about at a broad system level, I'm actually talking about at the specific field level. You need to answer questions like, what data do I have? Where does this data live, in terms of what systems? Is it consistent across all of the agencies or departments that are using it? Is it consistent across the fiscal years? Another question you may want to ask is who owns this data, each element, right? That's a very important question because if you find a problem with the data, and even if it surfaces, later during your AI implementation, you may need to be answering the question, right? Who can fix this problem? Who do I need to go to that owns this data to resolve it, right? So this work, I get it, right? This is not glamorous, but it is very important. The next step is to establish some sort of data governance before you move forward with your AI implementation, right? So again, you need to be answering questions like, what type of data am I allowed to send to an AI service, right? Or what types of data, kind of the inverse, right? What data should I withhold from the AI service? And think about that. That should be is probably like a policy decision, and it could be things like, hey, anything related to employee salaries that needs to stay out of AI because that is protected in private. For just for example. The other thing that goes along with that is to identify who actually kind of makes those decisions, right? Who's setting that policy, who kind of looks at your design of the AI integration and says, yep, this aligns with the policy, we're good, right? And then the third, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, right, is start with your strongest data first. Don't go into it thinking like, oh, now I have this, massive project where I have to fix all my data across my enterprise. That's so daunting. Lance, you're crazy. I'm never going to do this. I'd actually look at it the opposite way. You say, you probably know where you have strong data, high quality data, consistent data. Now, use that as your foundation and say, what business use cases or kind of, workflow business processes that you have that use that data, right? So then drive to your use cases from the foundation of that good data. All right. Now that we've kind of covered data, then the next one is probably pretty obvious. The next foundation that we're going to talk about, and that is governance. So for this audience, I probably don't need a long kind of intro why governance matters, right? You live and breathe this every day. You understand controls, you understand accountability. This particular quote comes from a recent blog that I wrote on AI in state and local government, and I believe in this quote very strongly, right? If you think about this, a lot of commercial AI conversation and hype is really centered and focused around speed, right? It's all about how quickly we can deploy, how quickly we can scale, how quickly we can add new features. And in government, as we talked about earlier, right, you have a different responsibility, right? You are worried about things like public trust, about auditability, about transparency, about human accountability, right? So in government, governance is not just a compliance layer that you kind of slap on at the end, right? And we're starting to see this kind of perspective bleed over actually into the commercial sector. AI governance is becoming not a nice to have. It is a table stake. It is a core piece of the infrastructure. So what do I actually mean by that, right? So I included this slide because it shows that governance is no longer just a side conversation, right? It's becoming a core requirement for AI. And this is something we've really taken to heart at CGI. So the Forrester projection there, it's interesting because it's suggesting that even in these commercial organizations that are really optimized for speed and acceleration, right? They are recognizing they need to establish some sort of governance even at a very, very senior level, right? So that should tell you something about where the market is headed. And the IDC point, it also matters because when you start thinking about what AI is starting to do, right? It's not just going to be used for summarization. It is going to be used for recommendations, actually moving work through a process. When you have weak controls in kind of a lack of governance, that they become a much bigger deal, right? The risks are higher, the stakes are higher, right? And these are not just technical risks, right? These risks are things like legal, operational, reputational, right? And for government, the risks are similar, but you have the added weight of additional public accountability, public scrutiny. So the question is not just how fast can I enable AI? The better question is how do we enable it in a way that people can trust it, that you can audit it, that you can defend it over time. And that's where governance has become not just conceptual, but actually operational. So what you're probably asking, okay, that kind of makes sense, but like, what does this actually mean in practice? So first, I'd look at it this way, right? AI capabilities should be intentionally enabled. They should not be turned on everywhere by default. So if you kind of bring this back to policies and alignment with policies, right, you need to have a system that has granular control over different features. Because everybody on this call may be coming to us from a different place. You may have different policies of what is, acceptable use, and what is tolerated, right? And what may work for one may not work for the other. So you need to be able to turn on and off features at different levels. The second is really the human accountability has to remain clear, right? So AI can help, it can assist, it can summarize, it can make recommendations, but the responsibility still has to rest solely on the people. So that means organizations need to distinguish clearly between what was AI generated and what the human reviewed and what decision or work was ultimately done, right? The third is that the activities, they need to be role-based. They need to be logged. They need to be traceable. Again, right, this maps back to kind of governance best practices and not a one-size-fits-all approach, but be able to say, okay, this cohort of users, they should be able to do these types of things with AI. These other ones, I'm going to limit their access a little bit more. And no matter what anybody does with AI, we're going to log it. We're going to be able to audit it. We're going to be able to reconstruct what happens later. And that's really the fourth point, right? The governance should be built for and with auditors, right, from the very beginning, not after deployment, right? That is where issues crop up when auditors are involved later and they say, hey, well, how are we checking for all these different things? You haven't built it in, you haven't designed it into the system, right? You get those auditors involved early, they can identify those traceability requirements, right? The accountability requirements, and that's a part of the design, right? Now, even with strong data, even with strong governance, right, there's a third foundation that sometimes can bring everything down if you don't have it squared away, and that is adoption. Now, I want to call out this statistic because I think it captures one of the biggest risks that I see with AI, especially in ERP and finance systems. So Gartner predicts, right, that by 2030, more than 70%, 70% of ERP AI capabilities are going to become shelfware, right? Let that sink in. Think about that for a second. That means so an organization has purchased a capability. They probably have even implemented it, but it won't be used, right? And I don't think that happens because the technology has no potential, right? I think it happens because there's another element here that that is beyond the technology, and that is the human element, right? And it drives to adoption that the people using it need to trust the output. They need to understand how it works. They need to understand how it impacts their day-to-day workflow. And they need to know where their human judgment still matters, right? And that's why the third foundation that we're going to talk about is adoption. So this is the foundation that I think many organizations often underestimate, right? The implementation and adoption, they're not the same thing, right? A system can go live on time, pass all the testing, meet all the technical requirements, but it can still fail to deliver value if people are not actually using it in their daily work, right? So go live, if you think about it, go live is an IT milestone, right? That is something that you point to and say, yes, we did that, right? But adoption, that's a completely different story, right? Adoption is about leadership. It is about change management. It is, squarely in the kind of the human category, not IT. And AI makes that especially important because AI changes more than just like a screen or a workflow, kind of adding a button or a widget, right? It can change how people work, how they review information, how they make decisions. And that naturally creates questions, right? It can also create anxiety. So adoption cannot be treated just as a training event that kind of communicate at the end of a project, right? It needs to be something that you address throughout the life cycle of the project, right? Because success is not just when the solution goes live. Success is when people trust it and they use it consistently and they incorporate it into their day-to-day work, right? So you're probably saying, Lance, okay, that makes sense on the surface. You keep, talking about these abstract concepts. I get it, but give me something that is concrete that can help me ensure that adoption sticks. Well, I'm glad you asked. So here are some three steps to helping you make adoption stick. So the first is involve people before you kind of roll out the feature, right? So not just as recipients of training, not just as somebody who's getting a new job aid or a memo to say, hey, use this thing, right? You want to pull them in and use them from the very beginning to leverage their knowledge, their expertise, to make them contributors, right? Stakeholders in the actual design. And here's something that may seem not non-intuitive, right? I actually suggest including skeptics, AI skeptics in your process, right? Your pilot groups, right? Those are the people who are going to really put the pressure on you. They're going to pressure test your process, your assumptions, your fundamentals. If you pull in only people who are excited about AI, you're probably not going to identify some of those adoption challenges that are going to come up later, right? But if you can get those skeptics on board, your broader adoption is going to be so much easier down the road, right? The second recommendation is to measure adoption, not just usage. So that may seem like a little bit kind of vague and not clear. So let me explain that, right? So measuring adoption is looking at things like clicks and logins or somebody accessing the system, but it's not really telling you is AI creating some sort of operational value, right? Better questions to ask and things to measure are things like, are people trusting the output, right? Do they feel confident about what the AI is generating or recommending to them? Are they incorporating the feature or the capability into their actual day-to-day workflows? Are they or are they incorporating but maybe kind of overriding the decisions or the recommendations that the AI is being making to them and why, right? And have they created some workarounds from the process, right? These are stronger signals than clicks and logins and things like that. And the third is to prepare and expect the human questions directly, right? So you're going to get questions like, how has this changed my role? What happens to the work that I do today, right? Does my judgment still matter, right? Like, do you value the things that I'm bringing to this role in this job, right? The organizations that kind of ignore and just say, oh, well, people are just going to have to get with the program, right? Those are the ones that lose trust early and their initiatives tend to stall out, right? So, if we take a step back from these three foundations, data, governance, and adoption, right, there are a few practical principles that I think separate AI programs that are successful and gain some traction from those that stall out and fall flat. But first, Josh.
There you go, Lance. Another water break for you.
Yep, thank you.
Code 3 of 5, 525. Please go and enter that into Conferences IO now. 525. 525. Thanks, Lance.
Yep. I appreciate the drink break too. All right, so I promised you four principles for successful AI adoption. So, and that's what I'm going to give you. So, if I had to simplify everything to what we talked that I've talked about so far down to four principles, it would be these. So, first, start bounded, right? Now, I'm not talking about physical bindings, right? I'm talking about the scope of your project, right? Don't try to transform your entire enterprise at once, right? Pick that one high value use case that is tied to data that you feel really good about, that you think is strong, consistent, that you have clear ownership of, or like you know who owns that data, and you have a use case that can be measured, right? It's just start with something like that. Now that I've said it, you're probably like, yeah, duh, that totally makes sense, right? But start bounded, start with that defined scope that's going to set you up for success, then build confidence from there, right? Get some momentum and scale out from there. So the second principle is engage your auditors early. Don't wait till after go live, right? Get them involved during the design. That's where they can bring kind of the wealth of their expertise, their years of experience, kind of bring that to the discussion, can drive some of those requirements early, right? Help define what is auditable, like what does that actually mean before the process is already is operational and deployed, right? The third, invest in the data. As I mentioned before, right? Remember, AI is a multiplier, right? It could multiply weak data just as quickly as it can multiply strong data, right? So data readiness, it needs to come before deployment, right? Don't wait till you've deployed something to find that your data is not so strong, right? And fourth, keep the humans engaged, right? By saying, using the word humans, right? I probably should say people, right? That sounds very anti-human, but right, keep the people engaged, keep people involved, right? Especially in the work that you do, right? The AI should support human decisions, right? Not replace them. So the common thread across all four of these principles is this, right? The organizations that get value from AI, they are the ones that are treating data governance, adoption as the real work, right? Not the technology, right? The technology matters. It's the tool, though, not the strategy. Right. So that may sound a little bit abstract. So let's make it a little bit more practical, right? Now, when we look at the programs that are really gaining traction, these principles tend to show up in a few specific ways. So first, they start with a business problem, not the technology, right? They're not chasing the technology. The conversation is not, hey, we bought AI, where can we use it? Right? They're not finding a cool piece of tech and searching for a problem. It's the other way around, right? They're coming with a goal objective or a problem and then trying to figure out how they can use the tech to achieve that. So the questions that you should be asking are more specific around like, hey, can we reduce the time it takes to do this compliance documentation review, right? Can we improve our reporting workflows, right? Can we identify anomalies faster and more effectively, right? That and keeps the work grounded in very tangible value, right? You're starting with the value that you're seeking as opposed to starting with the technology and kind of trying to work back towards the value. Second, they involve your cautious or your skeptical users early, right? Not just the people who are already pumped about AI, but the people who are close to the work, who have been doing it a certain way for a number of years, that have hard, practical questions. If you can address those questions, get those folks on board early, right? That's going to help your entire organization gain some momentum, in adoption is going to come from there. And the third is that you define success in operational terms, right? So not saying the system went live, hooray, what a success, right? It was success sounds like, hey, review time decreased, right? Or manual effort was reduced, right? It's kind of like bringing it back again to that business value. That's the shift. Successful AI programs, they're not technology projects alone, right? They are operational improvement programs that actually just happen to use some AI and some tech as like an enabling capability. Now, I want to leave you with something that's even more tangible, a handful of questions that you can ask, that you can bring back to your organization to kind of evaluate, where you are in your readiness, right? So regardless of where you are in your journey, if you're exploring or if you're already deploying, right, these questions are worth asking. So the first is, you may, and some of these are very specific because I do want to kind of go from the high level abstract to some really specific thoughts and kind of tee us up for some of the questions that we're going to be discussing here in just a couple minutes. But you may want to ask yourself, hey, can you see, or can the system show an audit trail for any AI assisted transaction, right? So if you think about the AI world, the AI can now start creating financial transactions, or it can assist a user to create that, right? So, and I'm not saying, can you point and say, hey, one exists, right? I'm actually talking, does your system generate an audit trail that can answer the question of, what did the AI do? What did the human do? What decision was made, or what was created in the system by the human versus the AI, right? These are some things that you need to think about. The second question to ask is, what happens when AI is wrong, right? AI is going to make a mistake no matter how much you test it, right? Especially generative AI. I don't want to get super technical, but it's probabilistic. It's not deterministic. It's not based upon just rules. It's based upon probabilities and math. So that means you're going to get some variance there at times, right? So what happens if it makes a mistake? How is that error going to get caught? How is it going to get corrected? How is it going to get documented? How are you going to learn from it? Or how is your system going to learn from it? These are all things to think about. And then third, how are AI outputs distinguished from human decisions in the same record, right? It's a little bit like the first question, but a slightly different kind of looking at it from a slightly different angle, right? If you think about that AI is starting to work with data, starting to do things alongside a human, right? You may need to distinguish between what did the AI do versus what did the human do. And fourth is this AI systems behavior consistent with your organization's ethics, values, legal requirements, policies, right? All of those things, right? This kind of gets back to the governance. How can you guarantee, or how can you show evidence that what you have implemented or you want to implement is aligned with those, all those very, very important things, right? Now, with that, I want to bring us to the discussion portion of our webinar. So we've covered a lot of territory. We've talked about where AI adoption really is today, why government is different. We've talked about these three foundations: data, governance, and adoption. I hope you'll remember those. But now I think the reality is, right, my slides can only go so deep. I think it's time to get into the discussion. And with that, I'll hand it back to Josh to take us through our dialogue.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lance. That was great information. And this is a topic that we knew was popular based on the attendance today. And we have several questions out there in the queue. Everybody, we're going to do the moderated portion first, but then we're going to try and get to some of those highly rated questions if we have time. So I'm going to kick it off. We've got Chris who's come online with us now. He's going to join the discussion. And my first question is for you, Chris. And this is that practical aspect that we're always looking for. What are the most practical near-term opportunities for artificial intelligence in finance organizations?
Thanks, Josh. First, thank you for having me today, and Lance, great presentation from the start. I think that it's important for this group, which is so near and dear to my heart, as a former comptroller, to understand that the public finance community is ripe with value and in AI. And so there does need to be a lot of work around. There needs to be a lot of work around what the areas are that make the most sense. But at a high level, we can think about audit preparation, financial reporting, summarizing large volumes of information, right? Those repetitive tasks that are really burdensome. They take time away from our staff and allowing them to focus on more meaningful, value-added work where higher level thought is needed. Um, Funny enough, I just met with a state auditor and their team, and we got to talking, and we talked just outside of the public finance AI use cases and the value that it could deliver to the general office management AI value that you can deliver as well, right? So you think about everything from public facing reports and communications, presentations to councils and committees and general assemblies and even to constituents, right? The ability for us to throw our reports that we maybe somehow created in AI partially, but to throw them into another system and say, hey, spit this back out to me at an eighth grade reading level. Spit this back out to me from the perspective of some legislators that might be opposed to this draft legislation, or what are some key things that I need to consider in going in. So, in helping to keep our teeth as sharp as possible, and understanding ways that we can better our staff, not just better our general operations, but our administrative operations. There are a number of use cases here, again, around that efficiency, the drafting of reports, the high volume, which we could talk a little bit more about, and some specific high value use cases. But I think those are the key areas that come to attention first of all and foremost.
Thank you, Chris. What about you, Lance? What are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think Chris covered some really important points. When I look at things, so just a little perspective, right? I work with government clients all the time. My background is technology. I focus most recently with AI. Obviously, I'm giving this talk, right? When I start any conversation with a client, I start with the question of why, right? And when we talk about what are the practical applications, or like, what is the problem? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? And that really is, right? There is so much time spent doing manual work in finance organizations, right? And a lot of that work is very rewarding, but some of that work is not as rewarding and is just very, very manual, right? Going through large volumes of data, like Chris mentioned, a repeatable process over and over and over. You're doing something. Like one thing that comes to mind when I talk to our clients using our ERP system is that, right? They're getting electronic invoices, and some of them are still manually keying those invoices in, field by field. That is not fun. It is inherently error prone, right? Somebody like either forgets to enter something or they fat finger something, right? It's not great, right? AI is great for dealing with those types of things, right? That is really the terrific use case when you take a manual process that is not fun and you can automate that, or if you take a lot of data and have it summarized, or and this one is really interesting as well, right? AI is great at finding exceptions or anomalies, right? And we kind of handle it two ways, right? We have data that goes through machine learning models to find those exceptions, but we also have a rules-based model that will look for things as well. Things like sensitive data that has been entered in fields that are not masked or protected, right? We can use AI and rules to try to identify and find those data problems and alert users to correct that data issue, right, proactively before the data has shown up on a report where it shouldn't because somebody keyed the data in the wrong place, right? So in summary, like I look at it as like start with the why, right? What are the problems that we're trying to solve, and it's going to let you focus on the highest value work first, and then I think it's the main things are look for processes that are repeatable over and over and over, right? Or where there's a lot of data, AI is great for those scenarios.
And one more thing that I'd add to that is value. You can't view it in a vacuum, right? And so in my mind, when I think about value, I think about a scale, especially when it comes to AI implementations, right? So on one side of that scale, or within one side of that chart, one axis is your value, right? And that goes from zero value to your organization to an immense amount of value in your organization. But on the other axis is effort, right? And you have to think about and be proactive in your evaluation of value. How much effort is it going to take to unlock that value, right? So there are different tools that you could utilize that might be very low code, no code, as we say, low effort that you have to put in order to get that updated document that's going to be more of a performance audit report, even though it started as a financial audit, even though it started as some other document, right? But then there are other things that we're talking about when we're doing maybe significant implementations or augmenting processes at a significant level that are going to require a lot higher of an effort and might also have that same value. And it's on an organization to really kind of plot it all out, right? Take a second and figure out everything that might be on your plate, everything that everybody's cooking and bringing for Thanksgiving, as I like to think of it, right? And then I know, okay, I'm going after the turkey and the stuffing first. I got to get some mac and cheese on my plate because those are the things that are most important to me. Those are those high value things that I'm going to go after. There might be some other things, maybe grandma's cooking her special pie and it's going to take a little bit longer. Hey, that's a high value. The effort's a little higher. It's going to take a little longer, but
Yeah.
I'm willing to hold off in some of my implementations right now because I know that bigger value thing is something else that I have to figure into my programming and how I'm going forward. So we have to be able to take that step back and think about the effort as well as the value associated with each implementation.
I
Well,
love
Chris,
that, Chris. I'm going to take away from that value as a Thanksgiving meal. That's what I'm going to remember. I like that. Sorry,
I
Josh.
can tell y'all are killing me. I had 7 pretzels and a protein shake for lunch, and so now I'm just completely derailed. But I'm going to try and stay locked in. Got to be professional, although I'm very hungry, I have to admit. So our second question, you've touched on this a little bit so far. What's going right? What's going wrong? What are governments doing well in the AI space, and how are things not going so well for government so far? And let me start with Chris on this
Okay. I think that one thing that governments are doing, well, listen, we'll start with this, right? If you are at the front of the pack as far as AI adoption goes, similar to what said earlier, you don't win a trophy, right? There's no plaque with your name on it. You don't get special recognition or some email signature that reads out better than anybody else's. But if you finish last, if you're
Yeah.
behind, if you're laggard, then you're inefficient, then maybe you're liable as an auditor. Maybe you're just an organization that the public can't put its trust into, right? So you have to think about not necessarily being a leader, but being somewhere in the middle. And what I am, and the reason why I bring that up is because a lot of the things that governments are doing right and wrong fall right in that path, right? The ones that are doing things wrong are just diving ahead. Lance talked about going after the technology, right? Going after the solution instead of going after, hey, what are our real pain points? Let's absolutely understand those first before moving forward, right? And the ones that do that and just chase throwing dollars after technology so that they can be first in line, it really gets them nowhere, right? It gets them a reset. And a lot of lost dollars and public accountability that they have to answer for. And then they're the other side, right? That are so nervous because AI is it's scary at times when we think about its implications to the workforce, what it means for us, even how we embrace it, security concerns, et cetera. And so on the other side of things, we have those governments that might be doing the wrong thing in that they're just hesitant to do anything, right? Frozen, like you see in a scary movie when when the bad guy shows up and you're like, run, run, run. They can't run because they're frozen in fear, right? but you need to take action. And so the organizations that are serving and starting off the best are doing the things that Lance spoke about. They're looking at their data, understanding their governance, they're understanding the relationships, right? They're understanding their people,
Mm.
and what their people skill sets are and how to leverage those skill sets. They're understanding the communication that's needed across the organization to be successful, the fostering that they need the right governance structure. With the right people involved. They're understanding, when we in Delaware implemented our first ERP system, it was a PeopleSoft ERP system. We moved from a mainframe system where I think there might have been two people from our IT department that were involved in managing and
Mm.
maintaining that mainframe system. Well, when we moved to our ERP system, that completely changed, right? Now we have a group of 15, 20, I forgot what the number was, of IT professionals from our IT shop that work hand in hand with our process owners, with our business owners. That same energy that we had and that we have in ERP implementations are necessary with every AI implementation, right? Every AI thought, use case consideration. We need to walk hand in hand because the business owners, it's our processes, and we're the ones who are most informed and understand how it should be moved forward. But we have to respect the right and the fact that the IT departments, they manage security and they want to keep us safe, and they're going to have their concerns too. And so we come at it together, and we work through it together. So you have to really identify all of those pieces in order to be successful and to make these AI adoptions work for you.
Thank you, Chris. Well said. What about you, Lance?
Yeah, I love the points that Chris made there. I want to bring it back to something positive, because I think when we talk about what governance are doing right or wrong, it's really easy to jump to the wrong. But there are folks that are doing some things right. We talked a little bit about it in the introduction there, right? But the folks that are seeing success are starting small, right? Starting with the use case, as Chris said, right? Not starting with the technology. Start with what is the problem or what is the value that I'm trying to drive, right? Work from there and getting the people involved early. The other thing I want to mention that's slightly different, I didn't talk about it in the introduction, was a concept that that is a big part of all the messaging that I do, which is making sure that your AI, whatever AI you're implementing it, right? Making sure that it's built into your core solution, not bolted on from the side. Now, that may sound like again, like not like super clear. So let me explain what I mean by that, right? If you build a solution that is a completely, or you implement an AI solution that is a completely separate, AI service, right? You're taking data from your core system, you're sending it over there, you're getting it back, right? What do you have to worry about, right? You have to worry about how's the data get from your core system to that service? You have to worry about, are you sending the data that's appropriate, that is approved, right? Like there could be data attributes, data elements that you're not allowed to send to an AI service. How are you taking care of that, right? Like that becomes like now an integration challenge, an issue. The other thing you have to worry about is the security aspect of it, right? So who has access to that external AI service? You have to manage that. Again, now that's now a new kind of project that you have to build security around that. You also have to start thinking about a lot of these governance questions that I mentioned and these kind of auditability questions, right? Do you have transparency into what that kind of external AI service is doing, what it's looking at, what type of decisions it's making, what its chain of thought, right? How do you get access to that? So all of these things, right? I'm not trying to give you this kind of mounting list of things to be worried about. I'm trying to point out, right? If you kind of go the opposite way and you build the AI into your core solution, you kind of solve a lot of those problems, right? Because the data in that integration, that issue is solved, right? You also solve the security issue, right? You should be managing the security of these features through your core solution. And then that audibility, right? In transparency, you probably have that kind of built into the solution already, and you're kind of leveraging that, right? So if I had just a couple things to kind of leave you with to think about, right, is to start with what is the problem that you're trying to solve? who needs to be involved in that problem that you're solving, right? Who are the key stakeholders that should be involved and get them involved early. And then think about, right, built in, look at solutions that are built in versus bolted on, right? It's not an absolute, right? There are always some arguments to be made and some use cases where kind of a bolt-on solution is the right way to go. But in general, I think primarily kind of look at those foundational built-in versus bolt-on solutions.
And Josh and
Thank you
Lance,
both.
if I
Thank you.
could, just one thing I want to just emphasize even stronger. I skimmed over it at first, but it's communication to our teams, right? And
Yeah.
so whether we're talking about implementations and expected outcomes, whether we're talking about the ability to grow professionally and skilling and all those things, we have to be able to communicate to our teams the expected outcomes and the support structure that we have and how we're going to go about it. Because as Lance said, there's so many IT implementations, not just AI implementations, right? But IT implementations that fail because of adoption. And adoption are, there can be many different reasons why we don't have adoption, but a lot of times it's because there's that disconnect, right? And that people don't understand why they're going on the journey. And yes, it might add value, but if we can't articulate that value and if we can't support our
Yeah.
people along the way to get them comfortable in extracting that value, then we don't have successful adoption. And that project failed, right? Even though it should have succeeded.
Well, thank you both. And you mentioned fear as a word, Chris. That's featuring heavily in our number one upvoted question, to no
Uh-oh.
surprise, with this discussion. The next question I have for you all, and we'll start with Lance on this one, and I'm going to integrate one of the questions we've received because it's so upvoted and it's along the lines of this. What does it mean to audit AI-driven processes, and how is that reshaping those skills, the responsibilities of auditors in government? And this question in the chat is about integrating AI into tools that they're using for their audits, and then the burden of a human having to verify the work, maybe that trust aspect
Yeah.
in auditing with AI. So, Lance, we'll start with you there. What advice would you give in that arena?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question because I think our natural reaction is to think about, okay, how are auditors using AI? But I think this question is really getting to a slightly different kind of angle or view of that, which is how are auditors going to audit AI, right? Not just using AI, right? How are they going to be able to kind of pull back the curtain to understand what the AI is doing, to maybe not right in that moment, but maybe sometimes weeks, months, perhaps years later, be able to come back and say, this is why a decision or action was taken after the recommendation of AI. So let me talk about it from a system perspective, because that's kind of like my default of where my mind goes. The You need, and I alluded a little bit to this in the four questions that I ended with. If you think about how you're going to audit AI, that means you need to think about what types of data do you need to collect in the system, right? Not manually, but in the system, so that you can do that audit of AI, right? So that boils down to when you're talking about AI features that may be powered by generative AI, or you're talking about things like what prompt was used, right? Even if it's behind the scenes system prompt, right? You need to be able to get to that. You need to know what AI model was used and maybe even what version of the model. It may not just be enough to say, oh, it is ChatGPT, right? You need to know, is it 4.4? Is it 5.4? Is it 5.5? Right? You also probably need to know what data was passed to the AI, right? And not just kind of like big picture data, not just, oh, it's financial data, right? Like, no, specifically, what if it was a transaction data, what data attributes were passed to that AI? What was the prompt that it was given? Was there other context that was provided to the AI? And then you obviously need to probably know what did the AI return, right? What was the response? Did it provide a recommendation, a summary? did it perform an action, right? Like, and if it did perform an action and it literally did an update in the system, you need to be able to log that and to say, okay, this update was done not by a human or a human using the AI. An AI agent actually went out and made that change, right? The important thing is, right, like when I look at this, I look at, okay, do you have the ability to reconstruct an action or a decision later, right? Weeks, months, years later, right? And if you need to reconstruct that, like what the AI did, what data do you need to be able to reconstruct that, right? To be able to kind of take those inputs, the prompt, the model, push it through, get the same or reasonably the same output, right? So that you can point to as an auditor and say, okay, this is why the decision was made. I completely understand, right? That makes sense. So, it's again kind of want to separate, right? Auditors using AI versus auditors auditing AI. And I think the latter is like somewhat uncharted territory. My guess is we're going to see a lot more kind of studies and documentation and kind of best practices around this. But the real focus is being able to capture that information within the system so you can get to it when you need it.
There's a lot of talk about our auditing standards even written for an AI environment. So to your point, the studies, Lance, and the research, I think that will be escalated very quickly. What about your thoughts on that question, Chris?
Josh, I've sat in the seat being an auditor at a Big Four organization. I've also been an auditee as a state comptroller. I think the plain and simple is we're going to have to get a lot more cozy and comfortable with each other, right? There's going to be a lot more communication. I think you guys hear that over and over again. I'm huge on communication, and I think that in order for us to be successful here, we're going to have to talk. Audit shops are in a very difficult situation, right? It is not only are they now responsible for upkeeping, embracing technology on their own, but they also have to understand the technology that's being embraced and evaluated and considered by every single one of their auditees, right? So it's you're looking forward and you're looking at what you're doing, and that's a challenging space to be in. And so we'll have to navigate through it. The big three pillars for me when it comes to audit shops as we go forward are really thinking about evolving our skill sets. So it's continuous training of staff. AI changes every single day, and every other week there's a new product offering. You need to understand that. Developing competency and understanding the different models. So, do we have somebody, at least one person in our shops, that knows and can understand and differentiate the different models that are out there and who's using what? Are we recruiting the right people? Maybe auditor, hybrid analyst, and those types of things. So, how are we evolving our skill sets? How are we upgrading our tools? What tools are we using to better be able to evaluate, right? So we're moving forward. There are a lot of the big four firms that are talking about continuous audits on populations, right? Where they audit 100% of the population. That's something that we couldn't get to before because it was too voluminous. Now we can get to it. So what does that mean for our staff? What does that mean for the tools that we need to enable our staff to do so? How are we leveraging report writing tools like Copilot or whatever in order to get a little bit better and make that easier in the administrative functionings. And then lastly, how are we redesigning our procedures? And Josh, you talked about this with like auditing standards. But even before you get to Yellow Book or any kind of auditing standards, let's think about what it means to rewrite our testing plans, right? Based on our knowledge of the different things that our organizations are doing. And we can't do it when we walk into the organization and we find out, oh my gosh, you got a new grant system, right? We have to be on top of it 6 months beforehand, 12 months beforehand, when that RFP is dropped and the proposal signed and you decide to go with XYZ vendor, then that auditor needs to be in the room, not to, to audit the process at that time, but to understand so that they could successfully audit it in the future and make sure they have the skill set to do so.
So true, so true. I think you all hit the nail on the head with those responses. We've got the next question, the human element, and this is the I don't know $1 trillion question. I don't know where we are now in the economy, stock market, and everything else. This is the question of the hour. We'll start with Chris here. What are the most significant human and organizational impacts of AI adoption? And how should those realities shape the implementation strategy?
So I want to talk about some that are maybe a path less traveled, but considerations that we need to make. We need to think about public trust as we choose to adopt or not adopt AI, and really what that means for how the public perceives us in our offices. We need to think about retaining and attracting resources. So in a world where you look at your commercial counterparts and the AP clerk that sits in those offices, what they're doing, how they're skilling up, how they're being used, and then you look at what we're doing in our offices, are we still attractive in a world that's moving forward with AI when we're still, using stones and chisels to write letters and they're, operating in the Jetsons age? We need to think about employee morale and confidence and bringing those employees aboard the right way with with the skill set and making sure that we foster that right amount of confidence so that they can feel very comfortable in their space, a space that might include in the near future them managing non-humans, right? Them managing agents. And that's a real situation that will exist in the future, in the very near future, and we need to get our people up on it. And then, just the efficiency piece to it and having our people become more efficient, and communicating what that efficiency looks like. So, there's a world in some AI adoptions that I've seen in my role in Microsoft where there's a disconnect where people are getting their work done faster, but they're not getting more work done, right? And so, sometimes when we're in a space where we're drinking from a fire hose constantly, and you offer us a life raft and an opportunity to do things more efficiently, we'll take it. But then now I could use that other time to go for a walk, to do whatever, right? To invest in my public, in my personal health and mental health, and all that stuff is great. But we need to be very clear in how we want to evaluate those outcomes and those efficiencies and those efficiency gains. It's very important that as we go forward with our teams, we find ways to reward them. So whatever that is, however mechanism you choose to reward those teams, think about that, right? We're getting more efficient, but what are our teams getting out of it? Yes, they can potentially do the higher value work, but can they do something else? Is it some sort of event where you bring people together, recognize people? Is it something where you get that, extra hour of mental health cool down or whatever else it is? I'm just trying to figure that out is going to be extremely important, as we go forward and getting that adoption where it should be.
Thank you, Chris. Lance, what about this human element in all of this?
Yeah, I love how Chris mentioned, like alluded to like our the ability to recruit and kind of being competitive with the commercial sector. I think about it as that is very important. I focus on kind of the other element, which is what about all the people that are still in the organization, and as how are we going to help them manage the transition, right? I played basketball in high school growing up, and I remember my coach saying, if you wanted to change your jump shot, you had to take 1,000 shots a day, right? With the new form. Because why? Because you have built up muscle memory with the old way that you shot, and it's not just about like recognizing a better way to shoot. It's about retraining the part of your brain that does things automatically, right? Well, think about the way that we work, right? Some of us have, me included, by the way, decades of doing work a certain way. Then you're now, going to those folks and saying, "Hey, we got a better way to do this," right? On paper, that may sound great, but you are now having to work with those folks to retrain their brain, their behavior, their habits, right? And to perform their job in a completely foreign and new way, right? So if I think back to my basketball coach who said 1,000 shots a day, he didn't say for how long, by the way. He just said, right, that was the goal, 1,000 shots a day, to change it, right? Well, what does that actually mean for somebody who's done work, right, for decades a certain way? Like that is a real challenge, and it's not a technology challenge, right? That is a human challenge. And I think it kind of goes back to what Chris was saying, which is You inspire people by saying, right, this is what you can get for making this change. Yes, there's going to be an investment in changing your behavior, but here is the upside, right? But you got to scaffold it for them. You got to support them. You got to encourage them. One of the things that we have been doing in our organization is behavioral driven changes, or changing behavior with kind of a behavioral driven, like psychological approach. It sounds crazy, but it's actually things like gamification, right? Getting people in groups, like having targets, recognizing people that do well, like just a lot of fun stuff in it. In a weird way, it does kind of lower the anxiety around adopting something new, and we've seen some success with that. And now we have, we're kind of rolling out that type of approach with clients as well. But I definitely don't want to minimize it. Like the human piece of it, I personally think is harder than technology. We can't underestimate muscle memory. And the challenge is not just finding the right tech or the right tool. It's about like helping people learn to do their work in a new way.
Lance, I think that's great. I've got a comment on that, but if you could advance and get that fourth code, I know people will be
Yep.
looking for
Oh
that
yeah, for
fourth
sure.
code. We do have two more codes to go, just so everybody knows. This is 4 of 5, 956. 4 of 5. This is code 956. So we will have one more code after this, but this one is 956. My son, he practices basketball by watching Steph Curry on YouTube. And so he thinks he's just going to, he's watched thousands of hours of that. But that's a good point. I need to check. I read a lot about AI, but I need to actually get into our platform we have and actually use it a little bit. So you got me there. I'm feeling convicted, and it's a great point you make with the muscle memory because we
Yeah,
are all guilty of that. We've just got a few minutes left. I want to hit the top two rated audience questions. I'd like to
yep,
get those to you all, and then we'll turn it back over to you, Lance, to close things out for
sure.
us. But you all were all over this in your comments. The number one rated question: how are companies managing employee fears around displacement from AI? Chris mentioned efficiency, but some people may be thinking too much efficiency. Is that hurting utilization?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely, it is
Okay.
hurting adoption. And it goes back again, I'm gonna keep beating this drum, communication, right? And so I have a friend who works at a big investment bank, and we were talking on our college group chat a couple of weeks ago, a couple of months ago, maybe in late March, and he said, "Oh my gosh, I love these tools, these AI tools that we're using now, shout out to Microsoft." And he said, the tools, the thing about them is we've actually implemented, he works in their legal department as a fairly high chief executive officer within their legal department. But he said our mandate was that we need to reduce our workforce by X%. And he gave me a number on that X% over the course of this year with the adoption of this AI. So in that case, that organization was very explicit, right? They said that we are adopting this for the sole purpose of gaining efficiencies so that we can cut people cost, human cost, right?
Hmm.
Um, I'd argue that in many of our government organizations, our issues are that we are struggling to get done the work that we need to do. It's very tough, right? We're constantly prioritizing things and leaving work or picking up our laptop late at night, upset because we know there's 20 other things that we need to get to that we can't get to. It's not humanly possible. We have a balance, we have personal lives, etc. And so it has to be top of mind to communicate to our teams. This is the reason for the implementation. This is the reason why we're pursuing this. We are pursuing this. I had a state auditor that said, I would love to pursue this, but my biggest concern is what my communication staff is going to think. I got 9 people on our communications team. As soon as we roll forward with this, with all the functionality that we can do, they're going to think I don't need them anymore. Well, we'll just communicate to them to help them understand that this changes what they do and allows us to do a lot more. And if that's your purpose and that's your underlying goal, then we're communicating outcomes from the very beginning. And in communicating those outcomes, we get more adoption and we get that fear level to drop down.
That's great. And Lance, take us home. Well, you've got the rest of the time, and we'll get that last code after you finish.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. Um, Excellent. So, all right, as we wrap, I want to leave you with three quick thoughts. So, first, AI success in government is not about chasing the newest tool, right? It requires data readiness, governance, adoption planning. You need trusted data. You need clear rules on how AI is used. And then you need people who are actually understand it and will actually use it. Second, finance and audit organizations, you are well positioned to lead this work. You already understand the data. You live in a controls culture. You understand accountability. Those are exactly the disciplines that AI depends on. And third, responsible AI is not a constraint, right? It's how you build trust that lasts. In government, that trust is what determines whether AI becomes a useful capability or just another experiment. And with that, we just want to leave you with a couple of resources in case you want to go deeper. So these are two Gartner reports that kind of helped inform some of the discussion that we had today, especially around workforce change and ERP modernization. So these go by beyond the hype. And if you're interested, you can use the QR code and take a look at the complimentary reports. So with that, I want to thank you again to everybody who joined us and to NASACT for hosting us. I want to thank Chris for joining the conversation and have a great rest of your day. Let me go to that last code.
Outstanding. Thank you, Lance. This is the final code of 5172. Please enter that into Conferences.io 172. 172. Lance, Chris, thank you all so much. I really enjoyed the session. And Lance, I appreciated you mentioning Meredith earlier. I always thank Meredith John. She manages a lot behind the scenes for these webinars to make it happen. And please, we are collecting evaluations for the webinars, so you can see that in Conferences.io. If you would take a few minutes to provide your feedback, we use that to try and craft future events and give you what you need to try and make your job easier and keep you informed. Those CPE certificates should be emailed to you within 3 weeks. If you have any issues with CPE or questions, please email cpequestions@nasact.org. Again, that's cpequestions@nasact.org. And in terms of future events, on June 26th, we've got our annual GASB review. We'll have Joel Black and Alan Skelton from the GASB joining us for that. Always a popular session. If you're interested in learning what's going on at GASB and learning some tips and tricks for implementation this year, please go to www.nasact.org. As always, it is our pleasure to serve you, and I hope all of you have a great rest of your day.